Welcome to Elemental Energy, the podcast where we discuss how to simplify decarbonization. Here, we will introduce emerging low-carbon energy technologies and give you insight on how to navigate and support the evolving energy landscape. It is our goal to develop content to give you confidence to help transition the market and make low-carbon energy reliable and affordable. I'm your host, Marcia Leonard. Today's episode, I am joined by author Meredith Angwin. She writes the book, Shorting the Grid, where she talks about the fragility of our electric grid, and not just about the fragility of the infrastructure itself, but the political side of it as well. I'm hoping that we stay far away from the political side because it's a whole nother rabbit hole of just
Yes.
intricacies along with the grid. And we're going to be discussing a lot today about power generation, electrification, and it all starts with balancing our grid. So, Meredith, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us on Elemental Energy.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Meredith, will you please introduce yourself a bit further?
Sure. I'm Meredith Angwin. I wrote the book Shorting the Grid, but that was recently. I mean, I want to say that before I wrote the book Shorting the Grid, I worked for many years as a physical chemist in the electricity industry mostly. And physical chemists generally do pollution control and corrosion control, and that's what I was involved in. And I worked for the Electric Power Research Institute, which is funded by electric utilities, because really they have to be reliable. And a small utility may not have the resources for elaborate laboratories and elaborate testing. So they fund the Electric Power Research Institute to do these things. And I very much enjoyed working there. And I learned a great deal about quite a few different ways of making electricity. I ended up working in the nuclear group. I had started in the renewables group, but then I began having some doubts about how extensive renewables could do, and nuclear wanted me to join them, so I did. And at any rate, when I left EPRI, I had a little consulting company, and we consulted on corrosion problems in several utilities in this country and abroad. And then when I sort of retired, I came out here. Near EPRI was in California, and my grandchildren were in New York. So my husband and I moved a little closer to New York and moving to Vermont, where I discovered that Vermont Yankee was under endless attack from locals who wanted to have it shut down. Eventually, it did shut down. But in the meantime, I decided I would start a blog defending Vermont Yankee, and because what was in the papers was so slanted. And at any rate, my blog got noticed by some people who were involved in the grid, because every now and again I had to talk about Vermont Yankees' interactions with the grid. And then I became involved in the consumer liaison group of our grid operator, and on the steering committee for that. And after that, I that was about, 12 years ago. And I've been studying the grid ever since, and trying to understand how the decisions are made. It's not easy to do. The decisions are very closed door.
I realized that after reading your book, and I'm going through it a second time right now, just because there are so many things that I thought I had a grasp on with the grid, and it's making me see things in a much different light. And I thought where we could start is for our listeners, which are very elemental. Like, this is called elemental energy for a reason. We try to keep it basic and high level, but let's even start with power generation 101. How does electricity begin?
Okay, well, basically, our power generation is alternating current, and it's usually made by rotating machinery. So, for example, a turbine, which is fed by steam, or maybe it could be a gas turbine like a jet engine, and it's rotating, and then it will be turning a generator. Now, the generator will be rotating, and that will make the AC power. The AC power is then sent through a transmission system. Usually it goes to a substation, then to transmission wires, then to another substation, because when it's sent through transmission wires, it has to be very high voltage, because that's where it loses the least amount of energy. When it's high voltage, low amperage. But if you don't want high voltage coming into your house, so there's a lot of step down transmission between the high voltage and with your house. So basically, you could look at it the following: you have your generators of various kinds. They send energy onto the grid, and you say, well, what if it's a plant like a solar array that makes DC power? You're telling me it's all AC power on grid? I'm going to say, yeah, there's going to be something called an inverter, which will be with the solar array and turn the solar array power, which is DC, into AC power so it can get on the grid. So at any rate, so you have your generators, you have your grid level transmission, and then you have what's called distribution, which is low voltage transmission near your house. And the distribution, it's very clear what it is. If you look at a grid, you got a generator over here, you got these high, tall transmission lines there, and then you've got all the lines near your house, and you've got that line to your house, and you can say generation, transmission, distribution. But when you do look at the economics of it all, you discover that the transmission company is not very involved in certain kinds of things. Like, for example, your distribution company is the one that will repair people if there's a big storm, okay? And similarly, your billing will be done through the distribution company, and then they'll send some of the money to transmission and generation companies. So now, this is the way it is in what's called the deregulated, it's called the regional transmission organization areas, which are built around a set of auctions. In the old days, and the old days weren't that long ago, and the old days are still going on in large parts of the country, like the Pacific Northwest and the Southeast, most companies are integrated. They're vertically integrated. That is, they own the generator, they own the transmission line, or they rent parts of it, and then they distribute to the households. And so they are the whole thing. Now, one of the things about those guys being the whole things, that they had to be monopolies, because you don't want to have 20 lines to your house because there's 20 different generators on the state. Well, the deregulated areas got around that by saying the generators compete with each other, but there's only one line and one distribution company for your house. And that's going to be the one that bills you and that sends the appropriate amount of money back to transmission and generation. So that's the basics of it. And I'd also want to say that one thing that's really important, and people don't realize it, people talk about electricity as a commodity. And most commodities, you may need them, but you can take them or leave them at any time. What I mean by that is that I need food, but I don't have to have a continuous supply of food matched exactly to my appetite. But electricity has to be totally matched. There cannot be more energy on the grid than is being used. So there are these things called, the first time I heard the thing, I said, a BA? What's a BA? A balancing authority. It's a balancing authority, and every grid, whether it's a deregulated or regulated, every grid has to have one, which is the place that says, we have a projection here for how much electricity is going to be used in the next 5 minutes, 5 hours, whatever. And these are the power plants that we're going to need to have online to provide this electricity. Now, how they decide on those power plants differs between the vertically integrated and the RTO, but basically they have to be the same amount. If there's 500 megawatts of requirement on the grid, the power plants have to add up to 500 megawatts. Now, actually, it's more like 5,000. It's usually done in gigawatts, but anyway.
That on-demand situation that the grid encounters I've never thought of that, like how tricky it would be to measure and meter and be able to supply in the demand form. Like I was thinking, as I mentioned earlier, plugging in my phone that immediately demands electricity, and how they measure that. I'm still very confused and trying to figure out that process.
Well, I'm not clear on the measurement, but I do know that what keeps it going really is sort of the law of big numbers. That is, that if everybody plugged in their phone at the same time at 6 o'clock, everybody plugs in the phone, that could be a big problem. But as it turns out, there's thousands and millions of people, and some of them plugging in at 4 and some. So what I'm trying to say is it turns out that the net of all that is smooth, usually smooth. That is in the morning, people turn on their lights, they begin cooking some breakfast. Someday they'll be plugging in their cars or they're unplugging their cars. But the thing is, if there are a whole lot of people who are doing it at random times, relatively random, then there's a smooth curve going up. We're needing more and more power, and it's getting more because we need more and more power. But it's not a jagged curve. Uh, for what it's worth, I always find the English situation, some parts of it very amusing. And that is that in Great Britain, apparently there are some soccer or rugby or cricket games, or all of them, which have huge TV audiences, just huge. And what happens is when there's a break in the game, everybody in Britain apparently gets up and plugs in their electric kettle to have some tea. And so you actually have people in the balancing authority watching the games so they can get things going before this hits.
Oh my goodness. That's I love that. The afternoon tea in between game tea. That's a really interesting concept. Okay, so let's talk about too what is supplying the majority of that baseload power generation need.
Okay, I wanted to say base load is gets to be a very net. People don't like that term, but there is base load. What I mean is that some parts of the electrical system go on in the morning when I turn on my light. Okay, so there's a rise in electricity use in the morning. But in the middle of the night, there's still plenty of electricity use. As a matter of fact, it's rarely studied, but the studies that have been done in New York State, which include both the huge city and some very rural areas upstate. Okay, there's a lot of apple growing and dairy and everything upstate. Upstate's very rural. And in all the areas, 50 to 70% of the power that's used during the day is power that's on all the time. And it's only 50 to 30% that's variable. So that 50 to 70% is base load, the base load that's always got to be there. Well, what makes the base load power? Think about a wind turbine. It isn't making base load power. It goes on when the wind is blowing. And that may be very useful. It may be going on when it may decide it's beginning to, the wind is blowing starting at 6 a.m. when everybody's turning their lights on. But the wind could also start to blow at 1 a.m. or at 9:30 at night. Or nobody in this world that's a human being controls when the wind is turning on. And so basically, you have to have reliable power, which is sometimes called base load power, to make up that amount of the load, amount of the electricity use that is there 24 hours a day. Okay. And we don't tend to think of it as that important, but it is that important. I mean, where would you be if your water treatment system, your food storage systems, your all kinds of your hospitals, your all kinds of things that keep us healthy and safe didn't have electricity available 24/7?
So the baseload power generation that I'm aware of, a majority of it comes from natural gas. We still have some coal on the system, but explain too what delivers that baseload power.
Okay, but in my opinion, really excellent baseload power is delivered by generators that are basically designed to deliver baseload power, to deliver a lot of power very steadily. And so if you think about a road, the baseload power generators would be the equivalent of semis. Do they have high acceleration? No, they don't. Do they stop on a dime? No, they don't. What they do is they transport a lot of goods at a fairly steady pace, not a very fast pace compared to a sports car, but a very steady pace at a good price. So baseload power, in my opinion, the best kinds of baseload power include nuclear power, which is my fave, uh, coal power, which is nobody's favorite right now, but it is the base load for a huge portion of the world. And it used to be the base load for America too. And it is still 50% of the power in different areas of America. And then the other one is combined cycle gas plants. Combined cycle gas plants are really designed for base load, just like a coal plant and so forth. So you have to look at there's two kinds of gas plants. One kind of gas-fired plant is a simple, what's called the simple gas turbine. You can think of it as a jet engine that can go up to speed very quickly and come down very quickly, okay? You can turn it on, you can turn it off, no problem. The other is a combination of a jet engine, that is a simple gas turbine, with a steam cycle. So what happens is the exhaust from the jet engine, which is of course very hot, it's a hot exhaust, you don't want to stand behind one of those things, it boils water, which makes steam, and that is another source of energy. So with the combined cycle gas is one of the most thermodynamically efficient ways we have of making electricity. It's the highest percentage of input fuel comes out as electricity with a combined cycle plant, higher than a nuclear plant. I love nuclear, but I'm going to tell you that a combined cycle plant is the best for turning fuel into electricity. So, then people say, well, hydro is base load. That's a little questionable because basically most hydro that is in use now, you can look at it as having a pond behind it. That is, it lets some water back up and then it lets the water through. It doesn't let the water through continuously. Some do, it's called run of the river hydro, but that's comparatively rare. So I'm just going to talk about the hydro you see if you decide you're going to go, water skiing on some lake in the Midwest. That lake is probably, if it isn't Lake Michigan or something, it is probably backed up behind a hydro dam.
I like
And
that.
you need a bunch of them because you see, none of them can put out energy 24 hours a day. So basically, our hydro plant over here, it's kind of pathetic. It's 25% of the time it's available. Well, a bigger plant sometimes go up to 40 to 60% 40 to 50% of the time, maybe. 60 would be unusual.
Somebody once compared pumped hydro to it's almost a better thing to call it energy storage.
Well,
If
pumped hydro is energy storage, yes.
so that's where they actually take water from a reservoir below and put it up at the top and create almost like a battery or an energy
Right.
storage where whenever they could do that. And it kind of made me think of hydro in the same manner because the water doesn't always flow. So if you block it off, you can kind of have like an energy storage almost as well. So hydro is very interesting to me. I'm still learning a lot about it.
No, it is very much that way. You are completely correct. And as a matter of fact, for a long time, most of the black start plants in this area, that is the plants that could start up the grid if the grid was down, were hydro plants, because you just have to let the water over the, you don't have to, there's no pumps involved, there's no electricity involved, there's just let the water out. I mean, it's a little more complex than that, but they were mostly hydro plants.
So it was really interesting to hear you say, obviously coal isn't popular. However, it is a major supplier of that baseload power. I understand that storage on site is one of the big contributors to that. But let's start getting into the concept of that further and go into the fatal trifecta.
Ah, the fatal trifecta. Yes. What has happened is that the steadiest plants have become the most unpopular. And so the fatal trifecta is a kind of a slow motion train wreck that goes this way. The first thing that happens is somebody makes a slogan and turns it into a law. We're going to be 80% renewable or something. That's the slogan. You understand? That's not actually planning the grid. That's a slogan. And so somebody begins building as much renewable as they can, and then they discover, which everybody would have guessed, that the wind turbines turn when the wind is blowing, and the solar comes when the sun is shining, and that hydro backup, you can back them up with hydro, but you need something to take care of the gaps when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. You need something to take care of the gaps. And not every place has a lot of hydro. So what happens is once people have decided that their main goal in life is to put as many renewables on the grid as they can possibly get, because they've got this slogan that they call their planning document. I'm sorry to be so cynical, but planning a grid is a lot of work. And I'm learning more and more about it. I've been talking to this man who was with the LA Department of Water and Power about planning transmission lines. And I'm not going to say a thing about planning transmission lines because I realize that I know so little. When I begin talking to him, I feel I know so little. But let me say that you have all this renewables on the grid. Okay, you've got all these renewables and you need something to back them up. What is the best thing to back them up? For most of the country, it's natural gas, because natural gas, the simple natural gas plants, can start and stop on a dime. They're not quite a dime, but basically they're very fast acting. And, there's this whole thing in utility speak called fast response resources. And fast response resources are natural gas, batteries when you have them, and hydro when you have it. Okay. So now you have these fast response resources, that is natural gas, to back things up. But there's a problem with natural gas. It is used just as it's delivered. It is just in time. So you're backing up something that can go off and on when it wants to, that is the renewables, not because you told it to, with something that has to be delivered just in time. So for example, around here during the winter, and this is frequently the case for winters, natural gas is prioritized to be used in home heating. And so power plants can't always get the natural gas they want, especially when it's very cold. Another thing that can happen, depending on where you are, is that the natural gas pumping, the pipeline pumping and stuff can run into problems. The condensers can have problems. Everything has problems when it's cold, but the difference is that if natural gas is having problems, it's just not getting to the power plant. End of story. It's not there. And so you have bulls that start and stop when they want to. Natural gas, which is delivered just in time in the hopes of backing up the renewables. Nothing stored on site, okay? I'll get back to that in a minute. And then the people say, but not to worry. We're going to have transmission lines and we're going to get power from the neighbors. Well, you know what happens with that? That's the third part of the fatal trifecta. The first part is too many renewables. The second part is just-in-time natural gas. And the third part is overdependence on the neighbors, because the neighbors are having the same problems you're having. If you're having an incredible freeze, if it's below anything that you expected in the past 4 years, and the homes are using immense amounts of natural gas, what do you think's happening in the grid next door? These weather systems are not bounded by state lines and by transmission line reach. They're big. And so basically, the first time I noticed this was, I think, in 2011. I had just started my blog about Vermont Yankee, and I noticed that when it was a real cold snap, and I was watching where we were getting our power from up in the Northeast here, and I looked at it and I said, "Wait a minute, Quebec Hydro almost went away just now. Well, they're supposed to be sending us power." And they were sending us some, but about half the usual amount, because they needed it at home, because it was cold in Quebec, just like it was cold in Vermont. Anyway, that's the third leg, is dependence on the neighbors.
And I relate it back to the whole, you mentioned coal as one of your favored. Just, I think that storage on site is so important. And I missed that when I was starting to get into the power generation side. I hadn't thought of that idea of having coal there. Like, you literally get a dump truck or a bucket, and there's your fuel to dump into your facility on site without having to rely on natural gas, which I'm starting to learn and figure that out. So in chapter 28, we start talking about the issues with renewables coming onto the grid. We've already started to talk about, the intermittency and whatnot, but something that really piqued my interest was the concept of having to rev up and rev down your turbines, your natural gas turbines, to accommodate, and
Yeah.
how it becomes inefficient at some points.
Oh, yeah, it isn't efficient. It is inefficient. There's a recent article which is by Jan Emblemsvag, and it came out just a few weeks ago, a month ago, 2 months ago. Anyway, he's been doing a big study of Ireland. Now, Ireland has a lot of wind. It's right in the North Sea, basically. You could look at it as being in the North Sea, and it has a lot of wind. And so when the wind is blowing strongly, Ireland could make 70% of the power usage through wind. I mean, it's got that much wind turbines installed. It turns out that the wind turbines actually make about 35% of the power usage in Ireland, because basically the wind doesn't blow all the time. So it's only about half of the installed capacity. While the installed capacity is 70% of what's needed, the power produced is 30% of what's needed. Okay. And then you look at another thing, and then it says, oh, well, but at least the emissions have fallen 30%. No, actually, the emissions fell to 15 to 20%, because the gas turbines had to do so much ramping, and ramping is inefficient. Think about your semi going down the road, and think about a sports car. Which uses more per pound carried? It's going to be the sports car, because it's got that room. It can come quickly. It can stop quickly. And the semi is taking advantage of the inertia of a big thing coming down this road. And it's sort of like that with power too. So that if you have gas turbines that are running all the time, then they are going to be running in an efficient way. While if they're backing up some wind turbines, and they have to uh, go down when the wind is up and come back up when the wind dies down, they're not going to be efficient in use of energy, and in use of gas. You can think of it as, why does the American EPA list highway driving and city driving separately for a car? Because in highway driving, it can assume the car's just going along. It's not changing, you know?
Yeah, I love that comparison, the efficiency of city driving versus country driving to the turbine and the
Yes.
efficiency rates. That makes a lot of sense to me. So we are only going to need more electricity in the future
Yes.
to combat energy poverty. And I think that we need to, I'm going to use our fellow friend Doug, energy sobriety, when it comes down to helping people understand the sobriety of everything oil and gas and electricity need to come together along with renewables because we only need more electricity production. I'm going to ask you the $1 million question. And what is the solution to aid in the support of this increasing electricity production while maintaining reliability and affordability?
Well, my answer is simply that we need to have our base load be nuclear. And the reason I say that is that nuclear is very good at having a big plant that runs sort of nonstop, okay? Now, when you talk about affordability, I, people are saying, oh, nuclear is so expensive, but the nuclear plants that were built in the 70s, they ran very well. They have had very few problems. And when I was in nuclear, which was in the 80s, nuclear was competitive, absolutely competitive with coal. It was duking it out with coal. The expensive stuff was natural gas at that point. And actually, the cheapest material, the cheapest energy was hydro, because most of the hydro was put in with government help. I mean, in other words, the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, Bonneville Power, they all had help from the government. And so, and and as also hydro is, the fuel isn't very expensive. It's water, and evaporation raises the water to a high level, and then you capture its energy as it's coming to a lower level. But yeah, that's why I can say I'd like to see it be base load, because it can be affordable. Then, instead of slogans for the load following, which is between 30 and 50%, we could have small modular reactors, we could have natural gas, we could have oil. Coal wouldn't be particularly good for that, because coal is better for baseload. And in my dream, all my baseload is nuclear. So anyway, that's what I think we could do. One of the things we have to do is begin looking at the grid as a orchestra rather than a slogan. The slogan is, we're going to be 100% renewables and or die in the attempt. And I'm like, well, there's going to be people dying for sure, because if electricity gets unreliable, that's what happens. But if we look at it as an orchestra, then you need a certain amount of the steady stuff. And then you also need the piccolos, right? I mean,
The bassoons, you need them all.
you need them all, exactly. And they all have different profiles, you might say. In the orchestra, it's a profile of the different frequencies and timbre. But in the grid, it's a profile of how quickly it can come on and how steady it is and how inexpensive it is or expensive it is. For example, one thing that I was surprised at, but I shouldn't have been, is that if you're in the balancing authority with the grid operator has many constraints to keep things balanced. And one of the constraints is minimum load. And that is, plants really can't operate financially well at very, very low loads. So that you can't get a plant to do like 15% of its major output and keep operating that way. So you have to think about the economic minimums of the different plants here. So it is like a set of orchestra instruments, you see, what they can do, what they can't do. And of course, when you hear people railing against one kind of power or another, they're busily explaining that this kind of power can't do that. And I said, yeah, that's true. It's not supposed to. You're supposed to use a couple of kinds.
Where my imagination just took me is, when the orchestra starts to warm up and there's just all these like mismatched sounds and the
Yes,
conductor's trying to get everybody in line and he taps his conducting gosh, what is it called now? His stick and
baton.
his baton, thank you. And then everybody quiets and then he gets them into sync. And this is like the beautiful picture that you're painting for me about our energy future, Meredith. And I think that if we got any deeper in our conversation, it might turn into 102. But is there anything else that you'd like to close with and tell our audience about this wonderful fragility of our grid? It's something we have to address.
Well, the fragility of our grid is because we're using the wrong criteria for what we build. The first criteria is reliability and affordability, and then ecosystem, low pollution and low ecosystem disruption. And let me tell you that if you don't put those in order, you say, no, I want no, fragility is fine with me. What you're ending up with is an unaffordable grid where everybody who has enough money has their own Generac. They have their own little, generator. And that's really not the world I want to live in. If you read some of Robert Bryce's books, like Juice, How Electricity, oh no, that's the movie. The book is Power Hungry. Anyway, there's a movie too. It's a good movie. But at any rate, if you read that, you'll see that local generation isn't the panacea that you might think it is. It's hard to organize. There can be the equivalent of bullies, what he calls a generator mafia in poor countries. I don't think that if my neighbor got a generator, he'd be a mafia to me, but if you go to Lebanon or possibly even parts of Central America, parts of the Middle East, there's a kind of bullying that comes, I have a generator and you don't. So anyway, we protect our grid. It's what's protecting us.
Meredith, thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to continuing our relationship and getting to follow you and see what your next big project is. And for everybody listening, stay happy and most importantly, stay safe. As mentioned, the world is only going to need more power as we continue to grow in population and as we continue to increase our luxuries in life. And after reading this book, Shorting the Grid by Meredith Angwin, I highly suggest it to everybody and anybody who is interested in electricity because it really just opened up my mind in a different way of how people can leverage electricity to make or break somebody's livelihood. We are all so dependent on electricity, and knowing how fragile it is, it makes me think of things in a different way. It makes me think of how I need to be preparing in case our utilities do shut down, like the instance that happened in Texas a few years ago. And the last point of our conversation where we started discussing microgrids, I had always had high hopes for microgrids, and it made me second guess, like, would I really want a local utility or a local person being in control of my energy possibilities? And that happens in other countries. Highly, highly suggest checking out the documentary called Juice, How Electricity Explains the World. You can find it for free on YouTube, Amazon, and there's also another mini series. We referred to Robert Bryce a few times in the conversation. He is one of my biggest idols when it comes down to understanding the relationship between oil and gas and electricity. And I believe that his works are truly changing the world, along with Meredith's. I cannot tell you how many people I've encountered in this industry who have picked up this book and have just a whole new outlook and respect for what challenges we are facing, including the introduction of renewables to our already fragile grid. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you have any questions about this topic, or if you want to hear about this topic a little bit further, I definitely don't want to get into the politics side of power, but maybe in the future. Who knows? Take care, everyone.
That is your chance to be rude.